Would you pray with me? O God, may the words that I speak and the thoughts that we think be acceptable to you, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Have you ever heard someone say, "There's no such thing as a stupid question"? Anybody? Yeah? I know some of you raised your hands earlier. Yes. All right. I heard that most often from teachers when I was in school. And I was someone who was hesitant to voice my questions out loud. I was nervous to talk in front of people. I've clearly gotten over that a little bit, but I found it comforting when a teacher would say, "There's no such thing as a stupid question." It was like they were saying, all questions are welcome here. Even if you're not sure you should ask, please go ahead. Often, even if a question was kind of surface level or something that most of the class already knew, the teacher could use it as a jumping off point to broaden or deepen our understanding of the material. Throughout the season of Lent, we have been seeking to broaden and deepen our faith by exploring a number of questions along the way. Questions like, is this the fast I choose, from Isaiah? Or who will you listen to, from Jesus' temptation in the desert? And today we turn to a question that was posed by the disciples in John chapter 9. As they're walking along with Jesus, they see a man who is blind from birth. And they turn to Jesus and they ask, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents who caused him to be born blind? Now, from our 21st century vantage point, I think it is fair to question the disciples' question here. Maybe we don't need to go so far as to call it a stupid question. But I do think that their question reveals some assumptions that they make. That blindness must be caused by someone's sin, that it's a result of God's punishment. Their assumptions were probably influenced by the Greco-Roman culture in which they lived. But those assumptions can feel jarring to our modern sensibilities. And they're certainly counter to our current understandings of both disability and sin. We don't believe that anyone's sin causes blindness. In fact, as one pastor points out, the assumption that blindness, no matter the cause, is an inherent deficiency, a problem to be solved or healed or fixed, that's an ableist notion. In other words, it paints all people who are blind with a broad brush. It devalues them, dehumanizes them. So, while we might say that there are no stupid questions, I think it is fair to say that the assumptions underlying the disciples' question are simply incorrect. And Jesus tells them as much. I like how Eugene Peterson paraphrases Jesus' words here. He says, "You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no such cause-effect here. Look instead for what God can do. We need to be energetically at work for the one who sent me here, working while the sun shines." You are asking the wrong question. Look instead at what God can do. So Jesus makes a muddy paste, and he places it on the man's eyes, and then he sends him to the pool of Siloam to wash it off, and the man is able to see. Once word gets around about this man's miraculous transformation, people start asking all kinds of questions. We weren't able to read the entire chapter this morning. It would have been too long, so we skipped over some parts. But in one of the parts we skipped over, the man's neighbors ask, "Is this the same man who used to sit and beg?" And then they argue about it for a while. Then the religious leaders, the Pharisees, start asking questions. "How did you receive your sight?" they ask the man. When they find out that Jesus did this on the Sabbath, well, that raises even more questions. How can a sinner perform such signs, they ask. So they go to the man's parents, and they ask them if this man who can see is their son who was born blind. And if so, how is that possible? But the man's parents aren't willing to risk getting kicked out of their synagogue. And so they tell these religious leaders to ask their son directly. He's of age. Well, the Pharisees start grilling him again. What did Jesus do to you? They ask. How did he open your eyes? So many questions. So many assumptions. The neighbors assume that they can't trust what this man has to say because they don't recognize him, even though he's lived in their village for some time, possibly his whole life. He must be up to no good. The religious leaders assume that Jesus can't possibly be sent from God because he broke the law. And the man who can now see can't possibly be someone from whom they could learn because he was born a sinner. They know what God thinks and how God works, and don't confuse them with the facts because their mind is made up. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all, the man's own parents assume that they have to choose between their child and their church. And so they distance themselves from their son just as he's being interrogated and persecuted. So many questions, so many narrow assumptions. You're asking the wrong questions, Jesus said. Look instead for what God can do. But you know who doesn't seem to make narrow assumptions? The man who was born blind. He doesn't assume that Jesus couldn't possibly perform a miracle, and on the Sabbath, no less. And so he does with what Jesus tells him to do, and he washes in the pool of Siloam. He doesn't assume he knows who Jesus is, except that Jesus performed this miracle, so he must surely be a prophet. The man doesn't assume he knows whether or not Jesus is a sinner, except that the more these people interrogate him and the more he tells about his own experience, the more he begins to wonder if Jesus might actually be sent from God. But in the end, the people's narrow assumptions don't allow them to see the truth that's right in front of them. And the man who can now see is driven from his home. But that's not the end of the story. Jesus seeks him out, and then he asks him the most important question he has ever been asked. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And yet again, the man makes no assumptions about who that might be. So he asks the most important question that he'll ever ask. And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him. Jesus answers, you've already seen him. In fact, you're hearing his voice right now. The man responds, Lord, I believe, and then he worships Jesus. This man who was born blind has been transformed, and not just physically, but because he doesn't make narrow assumptions about who Jesus is and what Jesus is capable of doing, he's able to experience a greater depth and breadth of God's power and grace than those who are stuck in those narrow assumptions. This man's whole life has been transformed. Scholar Caroline Lewis points out that Jesus himself interprets this man's transformation in the first half of chapter 10 of John, the next chapter, where he uses the metaphor of the Good Shepherd. She says, Jesus reiterates that those who know him, his sheep, hear his voice and follow him. The blind man is one of Jesus' sheep, a member of the fold, a disciple. Like the sheep, the blind man hears Jesus' voice, Lewis says. Like the shepherd, Jesus finds the blind man when he has been cast out. Jesus provides for the man born blind much more than sight. He provides for him what he, as the good shepherd, gives all of his sheep: the protection of his fold, the blessing of needed pasture, and the gift of abundant life. Look instead for what God can do. All of this makes me wonder about the questions that we ask and the assumptions that we make. We might toss off the questions of the disciples and the neighbors and the religious leaders as questions from another time and another place that really have nothing to do with us. But the truth is, we make incorrect assumptions about others all the time, don't we? We assume that because someone lives in a certain neighborhood or looks a certain way or speaks a certain way, acts a certain way, or even votes a certain way, that we know all we need to know about them. I'm as guilty of that as anyone. When I first met my husband, I thought he was pretty cute. And then I heard where he was from. He's from Traverse City, Michigan. And I had met some guys from Traverse City, Michigan before I met him, and I thought they were all stuck up. So I had no interest in dating this guy. I'm so glad that I examined my assumptions and I allowed myself to get to know him. But we make incorrect assumptions about God too, don't we? We think that because we have a personal understanding or experience of God, we know all there is to know about how God works in the world and what God is capable of doing. The problem, of course, is that when we put people in boxes based on our narrow assumptions, we limit our ability to see the breadth and depth and the beauty of the human experience. And when, in our narrow assumptions, we presume to put limits on God, we miss out on the breadth and depth and beauty of God's power and grace at work in the world. Look instead for what God can do, Jesus said. Friends, it's not always easy to question our questions. It can be uncomfortable to examine our assumptions, and it can be downright scary to leave behind what we thought was true and change our minds. But we worship a good shepherd who sees us and hears us, even in our confusion and uncertainty, even with our mixed up assumptions. And when we're willing to follow, he leads us faithfully toward transformation, toward abundant life. Thanks and praise be to God. Amen.